down in the Seaport. And it was really fun because I had some jazz musicians show up that wanted to learn cyber. And I had some people from MasterCard show up that wanted to learn about jazz. And so for me, as a philosopher by training, it's interesting for me to use metaphors and analogies to explain things. And so I thought after a while, there were some quotes that I'll get to in a couple of slides in a minute, that inspired me to put together this presentation on playbooks and fakebooks. And so the idea here is that there could be some lessons learned, some parallels that can be drawn between improvisation in jazz and incident response in cybersecurity. And I think I like to refer to cybersecurity as not necessarily being a war and a battle. I like to think of it as a game. And there's two types of games in the world. There are finite games and there are infinite games. James P. Carse actually wrote a book entitled Finite and Infinite Games. And I believe Simon Sinek has also done a talk on a similar topic, and I heard he's fairly popular. But anyway, the idea here is that I think we might do well to step away from the war analogy and to get into this infinite game concept and think about it where we play defender, blue team, and attacker, red team, in order to improve our skills and to practice our craft. So I don't like to read the contents of my slides, so I have some speaker notes that I prepared. So like I said, rather than invoking this war and conflict and going to the war room and battling, I think it's useful to try to cast the discussion as an infinite game, because there is no done, there is no finish line, there is no we're now secure, right? Even though we get this ignorant question from executives all the time, are we secure? Mike was hired to make us secure, right? And so no, security is everyone's responsibility. It needs to be a part of the culture, a part of the mindset. And it can't just be the responsibility of anyone that happens to have the word security in their title, like Chief Information Security Officer. Some games are finite and they do have winners and losers. But when you think about the game of catch, there is no winner or loser. You're playing catch in order to practice throwing and catching, right? And that's one of the things that I think is useful here when we think about the analogy of cybersecurity. We need to have a mindset where we know we're playing an infinite game. We always have room for improvement. We always have to think about how do we get better at defending against enemies both foreign and domestic, and against script kiddies leveling up with AI and having nation state level capabilities now, right? I think of it as the democratization of crime. Anyone can be a cyber criminal these days. Lapsus and Scattered Spider are not APTs. They're not advanced and they're not persistent. Right? They're just good at social engineering, and in 72 hours they will exfiltrate whatever they can and try to sell it on the dark web. Or some of them are just doing it for the lulz. I remember it was down at Pier 40, or the City Winery, kind of the Googleplex on Hudson, when Charles Carmichael was giving a talk about Mandiant. He's the CTO at Mandiant. And he was saying they actually bring a high school guidance counselor onto their ransomware calls now, because a lot of kids are doing these things because they're being bullied in school and they want to have bragging rights. So that's what I mean by the democratization of crime. And if you think about nation states and organized crime, now we have to deal with bored teenagers that are doing it for the lulz. And of course, if we're going to have the energy to sustain this effort as infosec professionals, I think it's useful to think about your mindset and your energy and to recast this as an infinite game instead of a war. So anyway, one of the things that I wanted to hit next was the analogy. So anyone here a musician? Anyone know what a fake book or a real book is? Okay, one. So I'm a musician. I'm a jazz musician, actually. I was on the board of trustees for the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. Jazz is a great American art form. And the real book was invented, I think it was Berklee College of Music in Boston back in 1975. They wanted to make sure everyone knew the standards, all the charts, right? And there's about 400 of them that were published in that first real book. And then the fake book was the way to fake knowing the real book. And so that's the sort of origin of those two titles. And so everyone can walk up to any old jazz quartet, 4 random musicians can come together and say, okay, let's play How High the Moon in F. 1, 2, 3, let's go. And everyone can do it. That's what we need for incident response. We need to have playbooks not be bespoke and not be overly prescriptive. They need to be generic for different types of all hazard scenarios, whether it's an insider threat, whether it's a DDoS attack, whether it's a combination of a ransomware attack that was launched by an insider who's getting a commission on giving up their credentials that then is extorted with a DDoS attack. There's all sorts of things that are coming together in this world of incident response playbooks and how we write them, how we keep them up to date, and this analogy, like I said, for fake books. Incident response, of course, you have to detect things, and the threat actors will move laterally. They will pivot, right? They will be opportunistic. Now, when I'm playing in a jazz club, I play drums, I play jazz. The audience is not there to try to rob me or kill me, right? But some of these threat actors are there to rob me or kill me, especially with cyberkinetic warfare coming on the horizon. But anyway, so at Fakebooks, it's been, like I said, these jazz standards since the 1920s. I think there's an unintended phone. I think we've detonated because it's probably not happy. Anyway, so these fake books have been around, and jazz musicians know them, and Cambridge, I think the book was named after the real paper, which was a popular Cambridge street paper, and so there was basically this iconic fake book that turned into the real book. Now, of course, you can buy a licensed copy of the real book or the fake book, and it's not just something handed around by musicians, where they all photocopy the 400 pages and pirate, this intellectual property of all these great songs. Let's see, next. So the philosophy of improvisation, I have this great quote. This is actually where the origin of this talk came from. In Dizzy Gillespie's terminology, he talked about in jazz, there are no mistakes, there are only opportunities. It's a great philosophy for life, especially if the bass player is playing a wrong note. It's not a wrong note if the rest of the musicians go with it and change it, right? And that's the spontaneity that you get with jazz, and that's what I think we need in incident response. And so in this case, there's a respect for tradition. You need to learn those jazz standards. You need to know what Charlie Parker played when he recorded Cherokee and blew everyone's mind as a saxophone player. And so there's a tradition there. But there's also your place in this long tradition of jazz and jazz music. And so it's an incident response. I think we could talk maybe about, the North Korea, attacking Sony, right, and exfiltrating their data. I remember meeting John Scamone at RSA in 2019, many years ago. And everyone would think this would be a career-limiting move or event, right? To be the person on guard at Sony when they got hit, right, and hacked. But no, he's now the chief security officer for Dell, and he has 60 CISOs reporting to him. So putting a breach on your resume is actually a battle-hardened scar, and it's a badge of honor for many people. And let's see what else. The sustainable approach to resilience, you have this mindset of improvising and adapting. This is a continuous education that we like to try to encourage in our teams, to always be learning, always be thinking, listening to what the new kids are playing with. If they're playing with AI, great. If they're playing with Python, great. If they're playing with languages that are strongly typed, like OCaml, and they don't have null pointer exceptions that can cause a massive outage like Google, which then cascaded through to Cloudflare and brought down most of the internet last week. Anyways, experimentation is a beautiful combination of structure and form, where you know what's happening, but it's different every time. Two musicians, even on two sets at the same jazz club, you'll hear the song differently, in the 7 o'clock set versus the 9:30 set. Philosophy of improvisation. Like I said, there's respect for tradition, but also with experimentation. And you have this, what I'm going for is not very strict scripts, right, where you follow it to the letter. Because as our lawyer pointed out earlier, you can get in trouble if you don't follow your incident response plan. So you don't want an overly prescriptive plan that says in minute 35, we will have assembled on a Teams call all of the relevant people. What if Teams is the thing that's down? What if your access to authenticate to Teams is down? You need to have alternative places to assemble. Previously, I was the CxO for Marvel. I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. It's a good tagline. But when the call sign, right? Avengers assemble. Where? Where do we assemble, right? Especially at the beginning of an incident. You need to be sure that you can assemble and send emails and assemble on Slack. There was a hacker that got into Slack at Uber and was toying with everyone. Everyone thought it was just an April Fool's joke or something. Saying, I've hacked in, I've got your vulnerability disclosure program, I've changed all of your things in the password vault and exfiltrated them. And people were just, haha, funny, and no, the hacker was actually in Slack. Anyway, so runbooks should not be overly prescriptive. And like I said, musicians draw upon this knowledge of scales and chords and harmonies, and they quote other musicians, while they're playing a solo, they have a conversation. And And I think that's one of the things that we can do better in incident response, and not just have, you know, sort of one person leading the whole call and have everyone follow in line behind them. So everything should be unique to many of these different situations. Let's see, I think I'm on the next slide, right? Communication and interaction. Obviously there's this deep level of knowledge that jazz musicians have with the genre, with whether they're playing cool jazz, West Coast or East Coast jazz, a little more blue coat, you know, blue suit and tie, kind of uptight, like with Marsalis, if any of you know him, the Jazz Lincoln Center. And of course, each player responds to the others, it's dynamic, and during an incident, you need to have everyone contributing. You don't want to have just one person who's the lead, you know, on the incident response team, making all the decisions. There's a lot of smart people on the call that may not get their chance to speak up unless they're given a chance. And that's one of the things you do with solos during a jazz performance. Everyone takes a minute, you know, or two to play a few bars of a solo, the drummer or the bass player. And so that's the way you get the best experience and bring the experience of everyone's there at the call. Let's see what else. We can make sure everyone's listening, and of course, there's usually going to be two war rooms or two infinite games going on. One of them is going to be the executive team, and the other is going to be the actual incident responders, right? And then there's someone that's a go-between, because you don't want the CEO tapping on the shoulder of the database administrator saying, is the database back up yet? You know, because he got hit with some ransomware. You need them to do their job. You need this buffer between the two. And so I think it's useful to make sure that both of these infinite games are going on, you know, with a reasonable cadence, check-in period, maybe every hour, maybe every half hour, depending on how far you are into this. And you need to have, like I said, technical contributors, but you also need to have people that are explaining it to the pointy-haired boss. You can't have a room full of Dilberts and do an executive, you know, response in the tabletop or in an actual incident. You need to have both, because the incident responder is not in a position to decide to shut down the file shares, right? If there's a ransomware attack that's going to start encrypting all of the files for the business, some business decision is going to have to be made, and that's going to be above the pay grade of the incident responder or the first responder. Then, of course, spontaneity and improvisation. These are, of course, Gen AI images that I used on the background here. And it was fun to figure out. I kept getting men. Every single image that comes out of Gen AI, it's like men musicians, male musicians. And I was like, I have to explicitly say, give me a female piano player, please. And so I finally got it. Anyway, this philosophy celebrates the unpredictability and freshness. I think one of the key similarities is this concept of real time. Each incident is an individual experience, and you know we have similarities with past events and past incidents. Like for example, one of the things that was interesting that happened with the CDK, remember that automotive industry breach? You know, no one could buy or sell a car for a while. They were a single point of failure for the whole industry, and one of the things is that they restored from their backups. But of course, as we heard, the backups are vulnerable, and the backups have a capture of the stuff that you know had been breached, and so they got re-breached. They tried to exit containment phase too soon, and so that's an important part. You have to make sure everyone says, "Are we ready to go to the bridge?" Right? And so sometimes jazz musicians signal, you know, to the bridge, you know, or Miles Davis when he was playing, you know, he'd just be ignoring the audience, you know, and with his back turned to them and his head down, and like a voodoo master as he was playing the trumpet, cueing the groups that he was leading. And so I think in this case, we have to be open to the possibility that there's perhaps two threat actors present on the system. As soon as a breach happens, there's a piling on effect that can happen. And so you have to be careful to not mix signals and to not have two songs, you know, start playing, or to hear two songs playing and not having someone say, wait a minute, I actually think we have two breaches going on now because everyone knows that you're strapped for resources, everyone's working long shifts. They're trying to eradicate them from the platform, and so it's useful to try to basically work through your incident response plan very carefully and in a coordinated way, move into the containment phase and eradication phase and not too soon. The other example I'd like to mention was Western Digital. They're a hard drive manufacturer. They got breached, I think it was Black Cat, and Black Cat was actually trolling the incident response team by publishing screenshots from the laptop of the DevOps engineers that were investigating and looking for them. And so they were actually doing screenshots of the Zoom call and saying, oh, you're looking for us in the wrong place, we're not there. Instead of publishing these photos on the dark web. So really, containment hadn't been achieved yet, right? And so that's, again, this question of where do you assemble, for incident response. The other thing I want to mention, every threat actor is a player, and there are indicators of compromise, tactics, techniques, and procedures. You should be familiar with them, right? If somebody's playing a fretless bass versus an acoustic stand-up or an electric bass, right? It's a different kind of player. And whether you like it or not, the threat actors are dancing with you, right? You are interacting with them, in this infinite game. And then lastly, of course, threat intelligence feeds are valuable where the threat actor is heading next. A lot of people say, I don't really care who the threat actor is. I just want to get them out. But you getting them out is going to be based a little bit on psychology, a little bit on personality, a little bit on intent. And so when you're looking at organized crime and what kind of crown jewels they may pivot towards versus a nation state that wants to disrupt your infrastructure to make a political statement, these are different targets. And so you need to really have some sense of what is actually the directionality of the threat, and they will change over time. Let's see what else. Incident response. I have here the circle fifths. Anyone that's a musician might be familiar with this. It's a nice visual, at least. 5 phases of incident response. Now there's 6 and 7 phase incident response, kind of models as well. But you have preparation, prevention, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and lessons learned. So many people fail to actually do that last piece, right? They're just so tired and so burned out after the incident's finally contained that no one wants to go back through and create a timeline, do a root cause analysis, and publish something for the pointy-haired boss with the executive summary, and then create tickets and tag people and say, okay, how are we going to avoid this happening again? A lot of people do get hit several times for the same types of vulnerabilities, whether it's a Fortinet device that's getting breached every month, or it's one of your service providers like T-Mobile getting breached every 2 to 3 months. Think of not breach likelihood. I used to be the CxO at Security Scorecard. I evolved my thinking beyond breach likelihood and breach percentage and things like that to breach cadence. Do you want to pay for a security program that's going to get breached every 5 years, or do you want to pay for a security program that's going to get breached every year? And that's assuming this concept that we all now know, right? This mantra. It's not a matter of if you will be breached, it's when. And I take it one step further and say, and how often? Because obviously some people's security culture is really poor, and they get breached a lot. Improvisation is called for when you're performing incident response, right? Not all the variables and details are going to be known or understood. You don't have crystal clarity when you're doing incident response. You need to be careful. You need to have details, and so I was like I said, I wanted to show the circle of fifths to show that there's relationships between these musical keys, and both for incident response and improv, they rely on some degree of systematic and structured approach to problem solving, right? To have a hypothesis and test it, and then verify, right? And try to get 2 pieces of threat intelligence to increase your confidence level that yes, this is the threat actor we're working with. NetFlow data is showing that these are IP addresses coming from, living off the land. It might be a DigitalOcean server here in New York, right? But you can at least tell, the types of infrastructure that different threat actors will use. And then of course, there's all these sort of continuous improvements to our understanding of complexities around improvement and harmony and melodic lines that I think are useful for jazz to inform what we do in incident response. Then let's see, last up, I tried to map the players, and this is just sort of an effort or a small attempt at that. The bass player determines all of the legal notes for the rest of the group to play, right? Unless you're like Ornette Coleman and you start playing 13ths and 17ths, and these are the kinds of things that got him beat up actually as a jazz musician early in his career, because he was playing intervals that people didn't think were consonant, they were distant. But anyway, so the bass player kind of is the mastermind of a jazz or any kind of musical form. The drummer, of course, is the incident leader and setting the tempo, right? And they may go double time, they may slow things down to halftime, and everyone follows along. And they do it like it was planned, but it isn't. It's often, like I said, spontaneous and improvised. That's actually one of the definitions of jazz, is that it's not scripted, perfectly and executed like a studio recording. And then, of course, the soloist might be your digital forensics investigator, whether that's a saxophone or guitar or clarinet or flute. There's all sorts of musicians that can be lead in a given quartet or quintet that's playing. And of course, like I said, the bass player sets the chord structure that defines everything else. And so that's sort of like the frameworks, right? Are you using NIST CSF 2.0 is your framework, NIST 800/53 cybersecurity? Are you working with one of the esoteric frameworks with German auto manufacturers, which is called TISAX, TISAX? You need to be familiar with these frameworks and understand, when you're doing incident response, or what is the vocabulary and background of those players. Let's see what else. CxO changes the configurations. Jazz is about listening and having a conversation. Incident response can benefit from this core principle of listening, right? A lot of times, if you go back and do a root cause analysis and try to figure out what kind of metrics on your incident response, your time to awareness, your time to response, your time to mitigate. People that have lots of breaches can put up a nice chart on all of those and try to track those metrics and make them better. But in this case, you want to make sure that you're listening so that you don't make dumb mistakes. And say, someone calls an audible, on the line and say, oh, we need to reboot the service. And someone else hears server. So instead of bouncing the web application service, they bounce the entire server, which could blow a hole in a whole bunch of other apps. And so there's mistakes that can happen if you're not listening carefully, of course. And like I said, how high the moon, incident response, everyone knows how to play that standard. Everyone should know how to do, okay, we're having, an Iranian, social engineering attack, which is being, targeted towards the executive team. These are the equivalents of, like I said, the standards in the real book. And then, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I think team dynamics, real-time problem solving, learning from experience. These are some parallels that I want to point out. And the disaster recovery is not about just returning to a former state. It has to be about resilience and transformation and adaptation. It's not like we're hammering out a dent on the fender of a Volkswagen Bug, right, or Beetle. That is not what resilience is, right? That's a metallurgical engineering kind of like ductile properties and tensile strength kind of definition of resilience. In my mind, resilience is becoming stronger, like Nicholas Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile. How do human bones get stronger? They get stronger by being subjected to force. How do we build, anti-fragile critical infrastructure? It gets stronger the more it gets attacked, right? It gets better at responding to these incidents and cutting them down and getting back in the air. Because really, resilience is about how quickly you stand back up, not about how much you wring your hands in fear and worry about being attacked. And oh God, I hope they don't attack us. You really need to embrace failure in order to become resilient. That's what Chaos Monkey did when they did this program at Netflix. And that's what security chaos engineering is doing right now. Aaron Reinhardt and Kelly Shortridge have a book on the topic, which I recommend everyone check out, because it talks about thoughtful experimentation with failure, and to be able to improvise and to listen and to have different ways of understanding your infrastructure and making it more resilient. And then lastly, I think, there's somebody that has this Jazz Education Network. I had no idea someone had done this. And they had like 8 lessons for entrepreneurs from Jazz. So each player's job is to make the other musicians look good. It's important to study the masters, learn from mistakes, and move on. Don't be afraid of mistakes, again, like I'm talking about, how to embrace failure in cybersecurity instead of fear it. Creativity is for everyone. Mentoring is important, right? That's how you bring up the young players in the musician. That's why you have transgenerational performances happening. Where you have like an 88-year-old, Benny Carter playing, with someone that's 15 years old. That's just learning how to play saxophone, right? Just getting their first gigs. We need that kind of, generational transfer of knowledge and experience as well. And then, like I said, jazz comes in many forms. So does entrepreneurship. And so happy to have you all look at these slides later, if you should. And my conclusion, we need to see this work that we do as an infinite game and continuous improvement. And we need to have a perspective that allows us to have a sustainable level of effort, to not get burned out, to not get divorced, to not have a drug or alcohol addiction. There's a lot of wellness and health issues in cybersecurity. There was someone that gave a talk up at a bar near Central Park a few years ago. Jonathan, I think he was one of the field CISOs previously for Fortinet. And I thought it was amazing when he came out with this concept. He was like, okay, everyone, how many of you drink too much, right? How many of you are medicated, can't sleep? How many of you have been divorced, right? That should not be the cost of doing this kind of work. And I had a spoonerism once when I was writing this thought piece around health and wellness. I called it health and hellness. Yeah, that was the spoonerism. And so we're all pursuing wealth, as CISOs, and we have to go through this hellness to get there. and it shouldn't be that way. And so it works both ways. Well, health and wellness and wellness and wealth. Anyway, so real-time problem solving, quick thinking, adaptation. These are some of the characteristics I think that would make a really good team, and to train the team, and to use, like I said, jazz for some of that inspiration. So thank you for your attention and for entertaining analogy. There's one last quote, which is Pablo Picasso. Learn the rules like a pro so that you can break them like an artist.
Outstanding.